Good afternoon. This is Barbara Van Allen of the Economic Club of New York president, and we will get started in exactly 1 minute. Thank you.
Welcome to the 556th meeting of the Economic Club of New York in our 113th year. I'm Peter Henry, Vice Chairman of the Economic Club of New York and Dean Emeritus and W.R. Berkley Professor of Economics and Finance at the NYU Stern School of Business. With a distinguished history since 1907, the Economic Club of New York is the premier forum for discussion on a wide range of issues facing New York City, the United States, and the world. Our mission is as important today as ever as we continue to bring people together as a catalyst for conversation and innovation. We proudly stand with all communities seeking inclusion and mutual understanding. During these challenging times, we have prioritized our efforts on diversity and inclusion to bring together the best and brightest minds and subject matter experts to identify the dimensions of racial inequity and highlight approaches and practices to eliminate them. We will be sharing strategies, programs, resources, and business practices that the business and academic communities can leverage to drive positive change in a measurable way. We are not doing this work alone, and would like to thank our corporate partners, Bloomberg, MasterCard, PayPal, and Taconic Capital, as well as the many members, speakers, and subject matters experts that will be involved. I'd like to take a moment now to recognize those of our 312 members of the Centennial Society attending today, as their contributions continue to be the financial backbone of support for the club and enable us to offer our wonderful, diverse programming now and in the future. Thank you, Centennial Club. For our efforts in connecting with and encouraging the next generation of business leaders, we welcome members of the ECNY 2020 class of fellows, as well as graduate students from the NYU Stern School of Business and Zicklin School of Business at Baruch College. It is an honor for me to introduce my friend, my colleague, and our special guest today, Lisa D. Cook. Lisa is Professor of Economics and International Relations at Michigan State University. She was the first Marshall Scholar from Spelman College and received a second BA in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics from Oxford University. She earned a PhD in Economics from the University of California, Berkeley. Lisa is the author of a number of published articles, book chapters, and working papers. She's on the board of editors of the Journal of Economic Literature, one of the flagship journals of the American Economics Association. In 2019, Lisa was elected to the Executive Committee of the American Economic Association and was also awarded the Impactful Mentor Award for mentoring graduate students by the American Economic Association Mentoring Pipeline Program. During 2011 to 2012, she was on the White House Council of Economic Advisors under President Obama, where she worked on innovation, the Euro crisis, and small business. If all of that was not enough, Lisa speaks several languages, including English, French, Russian, Spanish, and Wolof. I don't think there have been many people on this program who speak Wolof. The format today is a conversation in English, because that's the only language that I speak with any proficiency, in which I'm fortunate to have the honors of leading. We're going to end promptly at 2:45. Any questions that were sent to the club from members in advance were shared with me, and this event will also take live questions towards the end of the program. At that time, if you have a question, please use the raise hand feature on Zoom, and we will call on you. As a reminder, this conversation is on the record, as we do have media on the line. Lisa, welcome to the Economic Club of New York.
Thanks so much for that very generous introduction, Peter, and thank you, Barbara, for the invitation to speak to the Economic Club of New York.
Well, Lisa, it's great to have you here. I want to jump right in because I know that there are lots of things you've been thinking about, and people want to hear what you have to say. So let's start kind of with the big picture, Lisa. I mean, during your career, you spent a significant amount of time in Washington, working on a wide range of issues, financial and economic crises, and recessions in particular. So we're in the midst of an unprecedented recession. What are your views on the current one that we're experiencing?
So that's a good question. Every financial and economic crisis is different. And as we know, this one is already different from the Great Recession. It certainly started differently, and it has manifested itself with such incredible speed that it makes itself different from any other recession that I've studied. One thing that is that has to be done in response to this crisis is a lot of fiscal policy. So a lot was done on the monetary policy front at the very beginning. It was done very quickly. Congress acted fairly quickly. That was great to see. Having been at CEA at the tail end of the Great Recession, but when unemployment was still very high, having been on the Obama transition team with you and others at the beginning when it was just hitting, we got some initial fiscal stimulative policy, and then it stalled. And we know what happened. That led to a stalling of the economic recovery. And we're seeing that again. And I think that that is worrisome. We need fiscal stimulus to states, for example, and local governments to make up for all of the budget cuts that they have to do. They have to have a balanced budget, unlike the federal government, and teachers and other people are going to be let go. They were let go in the last recession, and they will be let go as well, other public service employees. And that's going to prolong the crisis because, of course, not only are they used for public services, they consume things. So that's a big issue. I really hope that we can get a second stimulus passed, and this is something that the Federal Reserve has been asking for too, for fiscal policy to kick in. So I think that's where we stand, and I hope it comes soon. There are a few deadlines coming up. A lot of people will face eviction at the end of September if more is not done. So I am certainly hoping that the speed that we saw with the last recession is not matched in this one in terms of a response and the recovery being prolonged.
I think you made a number of interesting points, Lisa. But one of the things that really struck me, what you just said, which I think may go by some of our audience members, is the Federal Reserve is actually championing the cause of fiscal stimulus. Mm-hmm. And if we think traditionally about monetary policy and fiscal policy, I think to your point, in some ways, it really underscores just how dire the Fed thinks the situation is, that it's actually weighing in on fiscal policy. Have you ever seen that before in your career, Lisa?
I've never seen it before, and it is extraordinary. And I would agree with Jay Powell and other officials at the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is doing much more than it typically does. It has been creative and coming up with mechanisms to try to combat the crisis and its effects. And fiscal policy is where the action really is, with respect to direct payments to households, or even with respect to how that money is gotten to households. As you probably know, I had this mobile money proposal at the beginning of the pandemic to try to get Americans money fast, just because we have fairly antiquated systems. No crisis should ever not go used well, and this would have been an opportunity to upgrade some of those systems, a lot of which have been tested in the past by other payment systems outside the Federal Reserve, but in conjunction with the Federal Reserve, like Zelle, the Zelle payment system. But this is something that we really have to take seriously, that the burden is now squarely on the shoulders of Congress and the administration.
Lisa, can you tell us a bit more about your mobile proposal? Because I think it's a really important point. We're thinking of, in general about innovation in the ECNY, mm-hmm. and you suggested a very innovative approach to getting payments to consumers. Could you talk to us a bit about your proposal?
Yes, absolutely. We received in 2018 an emergency alert message from from President Trump, and everybody with a cell phone received that. And that means that for many different payment methods, we could actually get people money this way. And all it would take would be simple enrollment in a platform, a web-based platform, asking for 3 or 4 bits of information, make it very simple, very quick. And we didn't have a proof of concept at the time, but there had been a lot of experimentation beforehand, a lot of coordination with the Federal Reserve, at least on one platform, Zelle, as I mentioned. And the proof of concept was Canada setting up such a web portal. And they were processing their claims. People had money in their accounts within 36 hours. I was following this very closely when it was set up. And they were processing hundreds of thousands of claims in a very short amount of time, such that they could achieve the goal of getting people money within a day or two. And we can do that. We have the resources to be able to do that. And what I was suggesting was merging the cell phone data with IRS data and with other data, so that we could just send people money and have them take this one simple step. Now, we would have to use something else for the unbanked. This was mainly for those who were very mobile, and a lot of students were sent home, for example, so
Right.
they may not have addresses. There are people who don't file taxes. So there are lots of things that we could do for the people who had better access to a mobile phone. There's extreme mobile phone penetration, 80% to 95%, depending on the category, the age group, the income group. Many people have cell phones, and often these payments don't take a very sophisticated smartphone. They just take a cell phone. There's not much that one needs to be able to use these platforms. So I was just trying to get money to people as quickly as possible. This wasn't exactly a digital currency. A digital currency would be the next step, and that's something that I've been thinking about as well. But what I was really proposing was speeding up the process with a very, very simple mechanism.
Let's come to the digital currency in a second, but going back to the Canada example that you mentioned is very interesting. Do you have any sense at this point whether the quicker effects of sort of the quicker ability to get stimulus to consumers in Canada has had a differential impact in Canada versus in the US? Any sense of that at this point?
Not exactly. So what we'd have to look at is more of the household effects, and I don't have good data on, and I'm not even sure they have a pulse survey like we have, one that checks in with families on a weekly basis, and that's where you'd want to see it. I think that the other effects, so they had a multiplicity of policies, as European countries did and as we did. So it would be difficult to attribute one thing,
Sure.
let's say one intervention to say GDP growth or the decline in GDP. They had a similar drop to ours in the second quarter. So it would be difficult to see that, but I think it's worth investigating. That's something that I'd like to see as well.
And to your point on thinking about digital currencies, Lisa, I mean, do you think that this ability to use essentially mobile payments to get cash to people could be used more broadly, for instance, monetary policy? Have you thought about these issues?
I have thought about them, and I've thought about them in the context not just of mobile money, but in the context of, say, emergencies in other countries that didn't have quick access to dollars, who weren't part of the Eurozone, for example, and could participate in the currency swaps that had been organized by the Federal Reserve and coordinated with other central banks. There are times, for example, during a recent Greek crisis, when there wasn't access to euros for Greek residents, and there their payments were frozen. This is a way to potentially get around that, for them to have a currency that is usable. But not all digital currency proposals I think I am on board with. I think about the extraordinary cases right now. I know the Federal Reserve is considering this, so I'd like to hear more in terms of execution. And certainly my ultimate goal when I was looking at this, when I was at the White House, our ultimate goal, my ultimate goal, the Federal Reserve's ultimate goal would be to get rid of paper. It is still costly to process checks. And what we'd like to do is to have as few checks going to, say, the elderly, going to those who are on trust fund programs as possible. And I am frankly surprised that we still have so many checks in the system, but that would be helpful to get more efficiency, more cost savings in the system.
And speaking of innovation, more broadly, going from just sort of financial innovation, your research on innovation, Lisa, has received a lot of recent media attention. Could you talk a bit about your work on innovation and economic growth that's been so much in the news lately?
Well, one of those papers was related to the Emmys last night. Watchmen HBO was one of the big winners last night, and that is closely related to my research. So my research
and if you
looks
could
at
the audience, Lisa, just tell them what the Watchmen was about.
Oh, right, sure. It's a series on HBO that was that had a setting that incorporated the Tulsa massacre of 1921 into it. It was a racial massacre in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and it shows up in the data when I start looking at economic activity. So I look at the impact of violence, different types of violence on innovation, particularly on patents. And that says to me something about what would happen to economic growth, what would happen to economic activity. And I look at the historical experiment of violence happening to African American inventors and not happening as much to other inventors in the United States. So I look at patents from 1870 to 1940. And what we find is that violence can have a serious and lasting impact on innovation. I find that 1,100 patents are missing. That would be the size of a medium-sized European country at the time, which would be huge. And I also find that 1899 is the peak year per capita for innovation for African Americans. And to me, that is still stunning. And I did this calculation using 2010 data as well. It's still the peak year for African American per capita innovation. So that tells us the broader lesson and the cautionary tale is that all types of violence can have an impact on economic activity. And if you can stop it, if you stop it from the beginning, you really should try your very best. All countries should try to do this. And I think it has a contemporary application. I started it because of work that I was doing in and on Russia. I was working on the Russian banking system at the time when this question actually came into my head. And often when I'm talking about it, Russians or Ukrainians or people from China, where the rule of law might not be protected in the way it has been protected in the U.S. So I am grateful for the Planet Money podcast and other attention it's been receiving.
I think just to put a point on it, I mean, what you're saying is that the impact of violence on particular racial or ethnic groups within a country doesn't just have an impact on the economic activity of those peoples. It has a negative effect on the economy overall. Is that right?
That's right. That's right. That's right. And my more contemporary research actually makes that clear. So I estimate that 0.6% to 4.4% GDP per capita could be 0.6% to 4% higher. If more African Americans and women, and I would imagine all other groups, those are just the two that I've measured, participated in the innovative process. So it's not just those people who would benefit from participation in the innovation economy, but everyone. Standards of living would be higher for everyone in the economy if there were more participation by them.
So addressing safety and well-being of all citizens in society is not just an equity issue, it's an efficiency issue.
Absolutely. That's right. Absolutely. Well said.
So I think it's a very important point, and I think that's one of the reasons why your research has been receiving so much attention. It's fundamental for those of us who care about raising standards of living for everybody.
Right. Right. Absolutely.
So could you talk a bit about you've been doing some work on STEM and STEM related research, STEM fields as well. Could you talk a bit about that, Lisa?
Yes. One thing that I do in my research is to divide up the innovative process into three parts: into education and training, which means typically, but not exclusively, training in STEM fields. Then the practice of innovation, so participating at a governmental lab or at a research lab within, say, a pharmaceutical company. And then the commercialization of invention. And those three stages behave very differently. There are different statistics in each one. And what we find is that income inequality can grow and be sustained in the first two with respect to education, because STEM fields and those who are participating in the innovation economy, again, not everybody needs a PhD in electrical engineering to participate in it. I was speaking to a person who had a PhD in political science who is at Google recently, and I think that the critical reasoning skills that are needed, the creativity that's needed, comes from many different quarters. So you have salaries that are higher in the innovation economy. What we also find is that unemployment is lower in the innovation economy. And with respect to commercialization of invention, it's not just income inequality. This is where you see all of the IPOs and other ways of commercializing invention. You notice that you can have tremendous gaps in wealth. If we look at the top the richest people in the world, for example, and what industry they're associated with. Most of them are associated with the innovation economy. Most of them are tech firms. So this is something that is quite important. It's not just tech firms that are in the innovation economy, but this is just one indicator. And what we know is that 5% of VC funding goes to women founders, and 1% goes to African Americans, and 0.2%, 0.2% rather, goes to Black women. So we really have some room to grow, some room to improve with respect to that one metric of commercialization. I understand that it's a narrow measure, but it's just one measure.
I think your point of the connection between innovation and wealth is also interesting. I saw a study recently that talked about the correlation between basically how, kind of individual wealth and sort of, kind of economic security to go into sort of the startup world. And I wonder whether you've looked at all at basically, you talk about these shocks that hit certain communities because of racial violence. Mm-hmm. And these have particularly large wealth effects over time on these communities. I wonder whether that's also a part of the lower rates of innovation that end up coming out of these communities over time, basically this negative wealth effect.
Absolutely, absolutely. There are 50 white entrepreneurs for every Black entrepreneur in the country. So if you think about this as being a pathway to the middle class pathway to wealth accumulation, there's going to be a big gap between the two. And the resources available from let's say from lines of equity, for example. If there's any discrimination in banking, there may not be the resources available to start a business that others might have. And there is certainly, and I'm not the first person to point this out, there's a large literature on this with respect to systemic racism in lending. And we see that even with the PPP rollout, the Paycheck Protection Program and the CARES Act, if there is, there was from the very beginning differential access to banking resources, and this just exacerbated that because we rely on the large banks for executing the PPP.
So if you think about kind of the full kind of context of your research then, Lisa, these historical events have had negative effects, wealth effects accumulated as a result of that, and just the entirety of the work that you've done. What are some policies that you think could actually help to address this really important efficiency issue, the fact that basically US GDP is lower than it would otherwise be if we didn't have these incidents of racial violence and ongoing discrimination?
I have two answers to your question. One comes from the work that I've been doing with the American Economic Association to diversify the profession. And one thing that I certainly understand from our climate survey and subsequent recommendations, best practices, for example, that we've put forward, is that we've got to change the climate for people to participate fully in any workplace, whether it's in economics or in tech. We've got to make it welcoming. That's where you get the free flow of ideas. When we make it welcoming to anybody, and no one has a patent, no one group has a patent on creativity. No one group can predict where ideas are going to come from. They can come from any quarter. And I want to make sure that we're maximizing the number of ideas, the rate of arrival of ideas, and those ideas can come from anywhere. So I think one thing that we absolutely have to address, no matter what the proposal is workplace climate. And the reason I bring up the economics profession is because many tech companies are hiring us economists. And what I don't want to do is to take what's been identified as elements of our toxic culture to, or our blind spots, even blind spots, say, related to the census. Trevon and I couldn't originally find, in our work on Black names, we couldn't originally find our grandfathers in the census, not in the years we were looking, not originally, and then we found our grandfathers, but it just shows you, and this is well documented, that African Americans are underrepresented in the census. So what I don't want to do is for us to take our blind spots to another field and have those blind spots amplified. So I think workplace climate is absolutely paramount. I think we also need to count the people who are, we need to have demographic information on the people who are engaged in patenting. So I am extremely grateful that two pieces of legislation have been crafted based on my research. The Success Act, which was passed in 2018, and the IDEA Act, which is being considered now. And it directs the USPTO to get an accounting of who's actually participating. And as I said, I think that from my calculation, women and underrepresented minorities are not participating at the levels that that we should see, and that would help raise living standards in this country. So I think specifically about those two proposals as being ones that can be pursued systematically and for which we need to be held accountable, the federal government and other entities, stakeholders, stockholders, management should be held accountable.
So we have to make sure we know who's actually in and who's out in terms of participation. It seems like a very important point. It seems like an extension of your census point. We got to count. We got to count people. But going back to your point about climate, what are some tangible things that you thought about that we can do to actually change the climate, both within the economics profession, which has gotten a lot of attention recently, but also have you thought more about how to change the climate in the business workforce, innovation sort of hubs in particular?
The first thing is that first lesson that we know from first principles, Peter, is that people respond to incentives, right? And if managers were held accountable for this, then things would happen. It has been mandated, for example, that every company that is publicly traded, I believe publicly traded in California, has to have a woman on its board. And this is something that they've done in Europe, and the sky hasn't fallen. We can do the same for underrepresented minorities. And what we know from the literature is that there can't just be one person in one part of the ecosystem that is pressing for diversity and inclusion. There have to be people at every single stage. And the role modeling effect is just tremendous in the innovation economy. And it's the same way, say, in banking. I think more strides have been made in banking. We've had a CEO who is African American, for example, of one of the largest financial institutions, say American Express. Now, I'm not going to give undue credit to my cousin Floyd McKissick, but he was out marching. He's one of the speakers on the March in Washington.
Never give credit to the family.
I'm sorry?
Never give credit to the family, right?
No, that's right. Never give credit to the family. But he was, and he also, you went to UNC. He integrated UNC. He was one of the students to integrate UNC. He integrated the law school, but he was arguing to commercial banks in New York who hadn't allowed African Americans to get into banking to become a part of that closed network. It was typically, they relied on especially Ivy League networks, and there weren't African Americans in the Ivy League. So someone thanked me 2 years ago. This person in his 80s thanked me. Shouldn't have thanked me. Unfortunately, my cousin Floyd McKissick is no longer alive, but he argued for their participation in this, and this opened the doors for many bankers in the future to take advantage of that. And of course, that expanded to investment banking and so on. So in that sense, representation actually does matter.
And to underscore again, a point that you've been making over and over again in this talk is, the connection between having more diverse inputs and getting better economic outcomes. Mm-hmm. So the late Kathy Phillips, who was a professor at Columbia Business School and a personal friend, African-American woman, shown repeatedly that diverse teams in a number of settings, whether they be management teams or board teams or workforce teams, outperform non-diverse teams. And so just to underscore your point, this is not just so get diversity and inclusion, as good as it is to do that for equity reasons. In some sense, the most pressing reason to do it is for efficiency reasons. It just drives better outcomes.
No, absolutely, absolutely. One of the earliest findings in the contemporary data, when I say contemporary data, the post-1970 data and the patent data set, shows that mixed gender teams are more productive at patenting
Hmm.
and commercialization than single sex teams. So single sex male or single sex female. And it's not something that I was looking for. I was looking to extend the research on violence, and this just fell on the floor. So I was asking my counterparts that I talked to, typically made a trip to Silicon Valley every October to talk to my friends to get an interpretation, make sure that I understood what was going on in the data. And they were all not surprised. They were all not surprised. So I said, so why is there such a problem
Yeah.
with getting women on these teams? And they all claimed that it was above their pay grade. So I think that our interpretation, your former colleagues, your late colleagues' interpretation, uh, our interpretation has a lot of empirical support in
So you
many
really,
different realms.
but you also you one of the great things about talking to you, Lisa, is there's like an insight every minute, and you just shared another, I think, deep insight. I hope people recognized it, which is that it's not just about holding people accountable. It really matters who you're holding accountable, because
That's right.
if in an
Right.
organization
Right.
you're not holding the CEO accountable for diversity numbers, you're holding people at a lower level accountable,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Right.
Those
Right.
people don't feel as though it's in their ambit to actually do that, then you're not going
Right.
to get results. And
Right.
so, because you have essentially a collective action problem.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think what you just pointed out is the importance of having accountability at the highest levels, frankly. Uh,
Right. 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 And I would argue. I mean, that's exactly right. Every manager is posed with this question: have you been a good steward of the resources that are available to you? Now, if you don't have diverse teams, that means that you've not been a good steward of those resources, because what I've just said and what your late colleague has said is that diverse teams are more productive. So it's not about diversity as an end in itself. It's you're leaving $20 bills, $50
right.
bills, $100 bills on the floor everywhere. And as economists, this just makes us cry, right? Just makes our hearts bleed. How dare you leave so much money on the table? But managers are doing it. And if we're thinking about competition, if we're thinking about moving the production possibilities frontier as far out as it can go, we want the best ideas. We want to welcome the best ideas, as many ideas as possible. And one way to do that, and one way we have to do it, is to hold managers accountable at every level.
So, speaking of more ideas and inclusion, I want to be conscious of the fact that I've been asking all the questions and give our audience a chance to ask some questions, as much as I'd love to keep chatting with you, Lisa. So just to the audience, I can't actually see your hands. So please, if you have a question, just say something in the chat box, please. So while we're waiting for the audience to jump in here, why don't I ask you to sort of continue the conversation, Lisa? So tell us, what's most exciting to you now, and most pressing from a research point of view on the innovation front?
I think there are two things that are most pressing. One is that I've extended the research that I mentioned to you that uses lynchings, riots, and segregation laws to clean up the data on lynching. So I've cleaned up the lynching data. I have created the first national lynching data set. And what I did was to re-estimate these regressions using the cleaned up data. And what I noticed is that the coefficient for whites, the effect of violence on whites, goes to zero, converges to zero. And before it was negative, and I thought that's awfully strange. Well, it turns out it's immediate. The NAACP and others divided the lynching victims into black and non-black, and over the years, the non-black ones became white, or called white. And what I did was to separate the lynching victims by ethnicity and race. And so that was Native Americans, it was Asian Americans, it was Latin Americans. And what we see is that that takes away all of the punch from that coefficient, the effect of violence. So that's the first thing that I've done. Then I also looked at economic growth. So I did this sort of Johnson Robinson Acemoglu exercise, Acemoglu Johnson Robinson exercise, and looked at lynching as a proxy for institutions in some pre-period and the initial period. And I wanted to know what effect this had on economic growth, just, in normal periods. I think I used 1990 to 1995 in the States, in the US. And what I found was something that I was just dumbfounded by. Those states that had more lynchings in this period that I looked at, 1870 to 1940, actually had higher rates of economic growth. Now, the economist in me was disappointed, if not shocked. And then, I just, the right interpretation is systemic racism, if it can be baked into the system, if it can be baked into the water, if it can be put into the water, could lead to better outcomes for a given economic unit. And that is that, or at least in this country, doing so might have led to better economic outcomes. That's not a prescription whatsoever. That means that the economic growth that we've seen is not inclusive, is not shared, has been based on something that leaves a stain on the United States.
Got it. At least we've got some questions here. I want to
okay, sure. Okay, great.
So Abby Cohen has asked a question, and the question is, are the local financial institutions in any particular city or state doing an effective job in providing capital to previously underserved communities? Are you aware of any particularly good cities or states in this regard?
I am only aware in minute detail of Grand Rapids, Michigan. I sit on the board of CDFI, who has in its mission statement to help close the racial wealth gap. So I know that there is an ecosystem there, and it's a part of that, a new part of that ecosystem. It's less than 2 years old, who are addressing this. And my sense is that there are minority-owned and community banks, and I'm sure there's some overlap between the two, who've been addressing these issues from the period of Jim Crow, that have been in operation since that time. Atlanta Life Insurance, for example, has been continuously operating for that time. And I think they've been trying to address it, but I have no idea. I just don't know enough about the data to say anything about other places, other cities where this is happening.
Great. I see Ed Cox has his hand raised. Can we allow Ed to ask his question, please?
Yes. The question, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you, Ed.
Yeah. Thank you for your presentation. It's very informative. Over the last 50 years, there have been riots of one sort or another because of violence done to Blacks, either with respect to a Black leader like Martin Luther King, or with respect to police action with respect to a specific Black. And the riots have resulted in damage with respect to different communities. Have you studied that and the impact of those riots with respect to the economy and what they mean, and what in fact that says what kind of reaction can be done in order to lessen that kind of an impact?
So thank you for that question. That's a good question. First, let me say that in my paper that Peter and I were talking about, I do an exercise of trying to figure out what the answer to your last question is. So how do you prevent this? And the outcome is the first lynching has the largest impact. So you want to stop the first one. So whatever we can do using nonviolent de-escalation techniques, reducing segregation, we want to employ those techniques. They may be short run or they may be long run. That's the first thing. But the second thing is, and I think you won't find this answer too satisfactory, but I look at major riots between 1870 and 1940. I don't look at the current ones. I don't look at ones after 1940. These were identified in the select committee, the House Select Committee that was looking at the assassinations of JFK, Robert Kennedy, and Martin Luther King. And historians weighed in on this. So I've used others' experts' definition of major riot. And that was just to 1940. Bill Collins and Bob Margo, economic historians, have looked at the impact of riots in the period that you're talking about, in the post-1940 period.
Lisa, I want to thank you for spending your time with us this afternoon. It's been a really valuable and informative discussion. I want to also inform all of our participants today that we have many great speakers lined up, and as always, we encourage you to invite guests to our events. And I'll just give you a short sample of some of our upcoming speakers. On September 29th, we actually have two events. We have John Elkin, the chairman of Exor, in the morning, and in the afternoon, we have Jacqueline Novogratz, founder and chief executive officer of Acumen. And then on October 1st, we have Kenneth C. Frazier, Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Merck & Company. And you can check the ECNY website for a full list of all of our speakers. We've got a very robust fall calendar. We'll be adding more in the coming days. So please do monitor our website, and we'll continue to communicate with you by email updates. I want to thank Lisa Cook once again for joining us. Thank you, Lisa, and thank you all of our participants for joining us today. Have a wonderful afternoon, and stay safe, everybody, and stay informed. Thank you.
The pleasure was all mine. Thank you.